This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant and Pest Geek Podcast for the Living the Wildlife podcast. Always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and/or other control methods to manage pests. Wildlife Control Consultant, LLC, Pest Geek Podcast, Living the Wildlife Podcast, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here. Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing you another episode of Living the Wildlife Podcast as part of the Pest Geek Podcast family. I'll get it out there one way or another. Hey, thanks for coming along. Really appreciate you having here and watching. I got what I think is a kind of a great show today. I can't say that for every show I do, but today I'm particularly passionate about it because I think this is an important issue, and I haven't found anyone else talking about it. But before I get to that, let me just sort of ask everyone, hey, we appreciate dropping me a line. Tell me how the show is going, what you like, what you don't like. You can reach me at Wildlife Control Consultant at gmail.com. That's Wildlife Control consultant at gmail.com. Let me get that out again. Wildlife Control Consultant at gmail.com. I would love to hear from you. And if you have ideas for future shows, if you have a topic you'd like to have covered, perhaps you want to be on the show yourself, maybe you got something you want to sell. For some reason, people think it costs. It doesn't cost anything to be on the show. So if that's what you're thinking of, nope, not yet. Maybe when we become big and famous and you're begging to be on the show, then probably we'll be charging you. But right now, no, there's no charge. But if you have someone you want me to interview, do drop it along, and I will do my best to see if I can reach out and get to them if they fit with something that I'm interested in. So definitely let us know, and really glad to have you here. So what's today's topic? Today's topic is, you've probably heard over and over and over again, the label is the law, the label is the law, the label is the law. And yeah, the label is the law. Now, as I've said in another podcast or one of my blogs, the label is not the entire law, right? We've saw that when it came to issues about wildlife control, that a lot of pest control applicators think just because they have a vertebrate pest license gives them the right to control wildlife. Wrong. Wildlife is typically governed by divisions of fisheries and wildlife, not departments of ag. So in some states like Massachusetts, where I used to work, you're going to have a wildlife control operator's license. Just because you have your handy dandy little vertebrate pest category, it doesn't matter. It matters for using pesticides, but it doesn't give you the right to use those pesticides on wildlife in Massachusetts unless you have a permit from the Division of Fisheries and Wildlife. So check out your state, because some animals have no protections, in which case it wouldn't matter. But for those animals that are protected, like fur bearers typically, you're going to need to have a wildlife control operator's license if that state has one. So the label is the law, but the label is not the complete law, right? We get that. However, it's more complicated than that still. And I want to be sure that you're thinking about it. So what I did was I went online and I just grabbed a particular bait here. We have chlorophacinone soft bait. It's produced by Leafitech, right? It's not a dig on the company, folks. I just have to pick somebody to talk about, right? So I'm picking here on Leafitech, the chlorophacinone bait. It's a general use rodenticide. The EPA registration number is 7173 308, right? 7173, that's the company number, Leafitech, and 308 is the 308th rodenticide that they have, pesticide that they have listed, all right? No big deals. Chlorophacinone is the active ingredients of first gen. So let's open this up, and I want us to take a look at the label. So let me pull this up here. All right, so here we have the letter from the EPA giving them permission. So here's our label. This is not the label you're going to have in the package. This is the label you're going to see when you look it up on NPIRS, if you're not familiar with it, NPIRS. It's a way you can look up various pesticides that are registered throughout the country. You can pick your state if your state's participant in this. All the pesticides that are registered for your state, if your state's registered here, will be here. Like Montana, where I'm at, we use this. We're a part of this particular group. So this is for the public. It's to help the public understand. So what I've done here is I've kind of scrolled down to the part of the label that I want to talk about here. So notice what it says. Directions for use. Let me blow that up a little bit so make it a little bit easier for you to see. Okay. Pretty straightforward. Directions for use. It is a violation of federal law to use this product in a manner inconsistent with its labeling. Pretty standard, right? That's probably the same language you're going to see on thousands of pesticide labels, right? No big deal. But let's keep going. Read this label and follow all use directions and precautions. Use only for the sites, pests, and application methods described on this label. You're like, okay, Stephen, what's the big deal, man? I'm getting to that. I want to read that again just to make sure you got it. It says use only for the sites, pests, and application methods listed on the label. I got to get a thing out of the way. Described on this label. Use only for the sites, pests, and application methods described on this label. So that's three things. You have to have the site, you have to have the pest, and you have to have the method. You have to follow all three, and they have to be explicitly listed on the label of the product you're using. So what that means is when you go down the label and it says Meadowvole, you can only use the product on meadowvoles unless other voles are listed. Now typically you're going to see house mice, Norway rat, roof rat. Sometimes you'll see deer mice, and often you will see meadowvole. Sometimes you'll have another vole listed as well. My point is, if it says meadowvole, when was the last time you as a pest control operator, you as someone applying pesticides, checked to make sure that when you're trying to control voles, you're ensuring that meadowvoles are the targeted species on that particular property? You're like, what, Stephen? What did you say? Yeah, when was the last time you checked to make sure you were dealing with meadowvole and not some other species of vole? Oh yeah, there's lots of other species of voles. Lots. And here's the kicker. They're not easy to distinguish from one another. You may say, well, but Stephen, the label, the 2E, double E here with FIFRA, and by the way, let's take a look at FIFRA. Okay, we're going to go to the FIFRA here. All right, here's the summary of the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. Okay, 7 of the U.S. Code, Section 136, right, 1996. Let me bring it up specifically for you here. Here's the exemption. This is information you can find on the EPA site. This is what they said. This is a recommendation. It's called the 2EE recommendation here by the EPA. And it says applying, this is the second bullet. Let me blow this up a little bit more to make sure everyone can see it if you're watching on video here. If you're doing it on podcast, I'm sorry. You're going to have to trust me. Maybe pick up the video version later. Applying a pesticide against any target pest not specified on the labeling to a crop, animal, or site on the label unless the label only allows for the control of labeled pests. This is called the double E exemption. What this means is as long as you have the site proper, if you happen to control another pest that you weren't necessarily targeting and wasn't on the list of the label that you're dealing with, you're okay. The problem is when it comes to rodenticides, the rodenticide labels often have the phrase, you can only use this product for the pests listed. Now, when you're dealing with insecticides, when you're dealing with herbicides, things are probably a little bit different. Because obviously, if you're spraying for a particular bug, you don't always know if there's another bug nearby and that one can be whacked. And this is an exemption to make sure you don't get pinched for that. But when it comes to rodenticides, you read what I read on that Leaf-Attack product, and I'm telling you right now, it's not the only one out there. Check your labels again. It'll have that phraseology if the label's been revised the last probably 5 years. It'll say you may only use this product in the sites and for the pests and the methods listed or allowed on this label. In other words, it's a positive requirement. You can't just simply say, well, I don't feel like it. It's telling you must follow it explicitly. You can't just simply control deer mice with a label, with a product, unless deer mice are on that label. Okay? And you can't get cute about it saying, well, I'm killing mice on the outside, but you're really trying to go for voles. Right? That's just being cute there. We're not talking about that. You've been hired by your client to control voles. You would not be allowed, by the letter of the law here, to use the Leaf-Attack label and a host of other labels. I'm not singling out Leaf-Attack. Leaf-Attack's not the bad guy here. I'm not trying to bash the companies. All right? I want to make sure that's clear. I'm saying this is an artifact of regulation that should be changed. And I'm pointing it out because I suspect the vast majority of you, probably 99%, haven't thought about it. You're like, oh, vole damage. It says meadow vole on here. It must be meadow vole. No, that's not true. It might be a meadow vole there, but it may not be a meadow vole. You say, well, Stephen, meadow voles have a certain habitat. Yes, they do. But they're not the only ones who can live in that habitat. Meadow voles exist in areas that other voles exist in. Get it? So how do you know? How do you know? And did you check? Let's keep going. Let me point out something else for you. So here we have U.S. code. Okay, here it is. E, to use any registered pesticide in a manner inconsistent with its labeling. This is the exception clause. The term to use any registered pesticide in a manner inconsistent with its labeling, I'm reading it right here from the statute, right, means to use any registered pesticide in a manner not permitted by the labeling, except that the term shall not include applying a pesticide at any dosage, concentration, or frequently less than the specified in the labeling, unless the labeling specifically prohibits deviation from the specified dosage, concentration, or frequency. Number 2, applying a pesticide against any target pest not specified in the label if the application is to the crop, animal, or site specified on the specified labeling after the administrator has determined that the use of the pesticide against other pests would cause an unreasonable adverse effect on the environment. 3, employing any method of application not prohibited by labeling unless the labeling specifically states the product may only be applied by methods specified on the labeling. In other words, if the more specific the label is, the more you have to follow it. This is particularly true for our rodenticides. So when it says meadow vole and it doesn't list other voles, did you confirm that meadow vole is actually there? And I would suspect none of you ever have. You say, well, I know what a meadow vole looks like. Really? Do you know? Well, let's take a look here. Let's take a look at this particular document here. Pulled this up. Comparison of the morphological versus molecular characters for discriminating between sympatric meadow and prairie voles. Now, that's just a lot of fancy scientific language, and let me kind of translate it for you. Comparing the morphological means the physical characteristics like measuring the feet size, measuring the skull size, measuring the tail size and the ratio of the tail to the rest of the body. Some of these ratios are used to identify different species. That's what morphological. Morphological means body, right? So you have morphological characteristics, that is visually available body-oriented characteristics, versus molecular, meaning they checked out different animals based on their DNA, a different aspect of their DNA. And they were trying to figure out, how do we identify what morphological characteristics can we use to identify a meadow vole versus a prairie vole? By the way, and they overlap a lot. Now, as a rule, prairie voles like it drier, meadow voles like it wetter. So meadow voles tend to be in wet meadows, prairie voles tend to be in dry, grassy areas. However, both species can occupy the same space. And here's the other kicker. You can't rely on coloration, and you can't rely definitively on a host of other morphological characteristics like foot size, tail length, skull size, all that kind of stuff. Let me scroll down here to show you what it says here. If I can find the right section. Let me read from this particular article, and I'll give you the source again for those of you that are driving. Let me read this. Features of the second and third maxillary molars, that's the molars in the animal's jaw, are considered the most reliable morphological character for distinguishing between, it has a scientific name here for the prairie vole and the scientific name here for the meadow vole. But, when you hear the but, boy, that tells you some bad news is coming. Even with our small sample size, of which is 22, we encountered 2, which was 9% of their sample size, instances where molar shapes deviated from the expected based on a genotype, that's part of that DNA stuff I was telling you, of the animals. So here we have an indication that the best way to tell a prairie vole from a meadow vole is by looking at the molars. And they're saying even with that, there was a 9% error compared to the genetics. Now think about that for a few minutes. You're hired by a client to control voles on your property. You're trying to follow the label, and I hope you all are. Label says meadow vole. Did you take the time to determine whether or not meadow voles were actually there? Or was it a prairie vole? Or was it a montane vole? Or was it a longtail vole? Or was it a California vole? Did you check? And then the other problem is, even if you tried to check, which means you'd have to trap one first and then investigate it, other literature says even if you rely on certain measurements, you're only going to be 75% correct most of the time. In other words, if you have 100 animals in front of you and you're using various measurements, the best you're going to look for is probably a 75% accuracy. If you're looking at the teeth, it says here you're looking at it maybe a 91% accuracy. You still could be wrong. Now, again, I'm not blaming you for this. However, I suspect many of you didn't even think about it. And I do blame you for that. What I'm saying is that the EPA has labels imposed on us that, in effect, it's almost impossible to follow. Now, there are products out there that are very broadly written. They're usually RUPs, restricted use pesticides, that will allow you to control a host of voles. Some of your zinc phosphide products are like this, okay? There's also, I think, Vole Bait from Leafitech, which also has a very broad label if memory serves. My point is that the EPA should not be having labels written that require you to be basically a field biologist out there with calipers and magnifying glasses trying to identify whether this is holding out the teeth, killing the rodent, pulling out its teeth and checking, is this going to be a meadow vole or a prairie vole or some other type of vole? That's ridiculous. So in effect, we have people who are saying, yep, it's vole damage. And all they see is vole on the label. They don't read the rest of it. It says meadow vole, not just any vole. And they start using the rodenticide. That's a violation of the label if it has that restriction at the top saying it has to agree with the site, pest, and method. So did you check? This is an area I'm hoping that the industry can bring some pressure to bear against the EPA to get the EPA to change these labels to make them so that people can follow them without needing a PhD in biology. I'm being a little sarcastic. You wouldn't need a PhD, but probably a bachelor's maybe, with a big lab component. We need to do this. This is a problem. Now, if any of you ever get pinched, you have a zealous enforcement officer out there saying, did you check to see if these were meadow voles? You may have to rely on this podcast to get you out of it. Hopefully it would, because I think this is an error. Now, what is, you say, all right, Stephen, you brought us enough criticism. You pointed out how we're not following this correctly. It's been one of those oversights. Now what do we do? What's the answer, Steve? Okay, well, here's my suggestion for how to fix this. I contend that the EPA allow the labels. If you have meadow vole listed, they simply allow all the voles to be on the label. Unless voles in that particular state or area are threatened or endangered. And that would be done on a state-by-state basis. California has some voles, I guess, that are threatened and endangered. I think there are some in the Carolinas that are threatened or endangered. Then you would have the exclusion clauses that you often find with some of our rodenticide labels. Updating, making sure that the labels are, that the Bulletins Live 2 online are thoroughly updated to reflect this would also be important. I haven't checked, to be honest, whether there were restrictions based on voles on that, but that would be another way. So that way it makes it easier for applicators to be following the law, and they just know, because then it's just an issue, is this vole damage? And vole damage is very easy to identify, thankfully. You can't identify to the species per se, but you can identify whether that's vole damage or not vole damage. And so if the label allows one vole, it should allow all the voles unless there's an endangered species or threatened species issue. And I think that's the easiest. What I fear will happen is the EPA will recognize this as a mistake, and they will simply eliminate voles off all the labels and maybe force us to purchase products that have less generality. That will probably be how the EPA will do it, if I had to guess. But maybe I'd be wrong. My point is we should have labels that don't make it easy for people to violate the label through no fault of their own. And this is not taught on. Most states don't have vertebrate pest specialists. Most states are not teaching this. They're always worried about weeds and bugs, weeds and bugs, weeds and bugs. And that's basically where all the energy goes. And, hey, I regret my education deeply. All right, so wildlife control is the red-headed stepchild of the pest control industry. I get it. And we're probably even lower than that when it comes to vertebrate pests in the pest control industry. I understand we're a small market, so I know people are going to be offended. Redheaded stepchild. I had a person in one of my lectures get upset about that. It's like, gosh, get over it. The point is that
we know that we're basically the odd one out. But this is an issue that we have got to address if we're trying to be legal. Otherwise, we're undermining what we mean by saying the label is the law. We kind of wink, wink, and we don't really mean it. I hate that. If the label is to mean something, it needs to be followed, but it needs to be written in a way that it can be followed. And the labels as they are now, people are violating them, and they don't not that they want to violate. God knows we have enough people who deliberately violate labels. They violate them all the time, and they know they're violating them. But here's a situation where people didn't think they were violating the label because they didn't know any better. Right? And that's what makes me so mad. And I think it's a problem, and I don't know why, as if we're trying to protect the environment and solve a problem where we're trying to use pesticides responsibly, I don't understand why this is so complicated, other than just simply bureaucrats and people just not willing to be cooperating with one another, and let's just get it fixed. And this is part of that review process. And, and EPA folks, they're not overstaffed per se. There's a lot of pesticides out there, and sometimes bad language works its way into a product, and it's just not addressed. And I hope as an industry, if you folks in the NPA are listening, perhaps Pest Cemetery are listening, welcome. This is something I would need you guys with a lot more political power than those of us in wildlife control to bring to bear, to bring this up the food chain to someone who will actually care. Have I, in my day job, reached out to the EPA? The answer is yes. Okay, I even reached out to an organization that I'm a part of in terms of my day job, and will that make any difference? I don't know. But I do think that we should be having labels when we discover that there's a problem. We should be trying to get it addressed so that we have people legal without trying to make all these enforcement carve-outs, right? Which is really what happens. We just make these we just want to enforce that. Well, if we don't want to enforce it, then why don't we change the law? And that's what the label is, right? The label is the law. So if we're not going to enforce it, or we can't enforce it, then why don't we just change it? Why do we have to go wink, wink? We all know we're breaking the rules, the letter of the law here. Why don't we just change the law? It's a funny thing about America, and I think this is something that we desperately need to address. So let me kind of break all this down to you again. So let's go back to the beginning. We got this label. There it is. Let's read it again. You must use only for the sites, pests, and application methods described on this label. Fair enough. But then when you scroll down, it only lists meadow vole. So if you're going to use this product for voles, you've got to make sure you're dealing with meadow voles. Well, you're supposed to, but I know you're not, right? And you know you're not. And I'm telling you that even if you tried, it's hard, as I pointed out here. Features of the second and third maxillary molars are considered the most reliable morphological character for distinguishing between prairie vole and meadow vole. Voles have 3 molars. M1 is toward the front, M2 is in the middle, M3 is in the back. And they have upper and lower. If it's a capital M, it's the upper molar. If it's a small m, it's the lower molar. 1, 2, 3. So M1, M2, M3, and then of course you have right and left, right? So M2 and M3 are the ones that are the most diagnostic. And he's telling you, even with the work that they did when they compared the genetics with the morphology of the teeth, there was still a 9% error rate. And this is a biologist. Now let me cite the source again for this, right? And you can find this document online if you wish to find it, right? You can go on Google Scholar and look it up yourself if you don't believe me, okay? The title of it is Comparison of Morphological versus Molecular Characters for Discriminating Between Sympatric, Meadow, and Prairie Voles. I'll have a blog on this if you want to visit my website, wildlifecontrol.com. Authors are Andrew C. Henterly, Karen E. Mabry, Nancy G. Solomon, and Adrian S. Chesh. American Midland Naturalist, Volume 165, pages 412 through 420. So American Midland Naturalist, Volume 165, pages 412 through 420. Oh, one other author, Brian Keene. Forgot him. So that's it. And this was published in, what year was this published in? 2011. So it's not that old. 2011. I hope you found this informative. You're probably angry right now because now you're like, oh, there's now another thing I'm going to get pinched for. This is part of what we go, where this is the Pest Geek podcast. We go geeky on you, right? So we're going into the weeds here, and this is something I've sort of discovered, and I'm trying to raise awareness on it. And I hope that you and your profession raise it with your state agency. Get your state agency involved. And if you bring it up, we can protect each other in this sort of situation, because I think this is something that needs to be addressed. We need to have these labels changed to make this so that it includes all voles. And I hope that all of us want to use rodenticides responsibly, legally, and solve problems for our clients without having negative environmental effects. And we want to do things right because we're professionals. We're not just some hack. And I hope you would agree with that. All right, I think I beat that drum enough. I'm Stephen Vantassel, Wildlife Control Consultant. I'm with our podcast, Living the Wildlife. And again, if you have comments, thoughts, I appreciate those that I do receive. If you have suggestions for future shows, if you have interviews you would like me to do, topics you'd like me to cover, definitely reach out at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. And I'd love to hear from you, the good news or bad. And of course, remember, as we want you to live the wildlife, not be the wildlife. Take care.